implementation. And so when I talk in the paper about a marathon, I'm really talking about this much wider angle view of what was happening in Mississippi than just the literacy, which is really just one strand of a much bigger story. Because the story of Mississippi is how do we raise expectations for everyone, not just kids in classrooms, but again, legislators, the Department of Education, advocates, how do we all take more responsibility for what's going on in our classrooms? And that's why I call it a marathon, because there are so many different things that we had to do.
We jumped right into the story, and I've written a lot about some of the successful outcomes, Rachel, but I wonder if you could just briefly, for folks who aren't as familiar with Mississippi's success, like where would you point to? Why would you call it a success? Why should other people even begin to listen to us?
Well, I think it's no surprise to anybody that for a very long time, Mississippi was last in the country in educational outcomes and also a whole lot of other outcomes for kids in general. And that was sort of our national reputation for a really long time. And if you look at the nation's report card or the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is really our only nationally comparable data set around student achievement, if you look at when the test first started in the 90s, you look at the early 2000s, really the only thing that changed is that we were at the bottom with a couple of other states. We went from being alone at the bottom to being at the bottom with a couple of other states. And from that place of being tied for last over the course of the early 2000s all the way up to 2019, right before the pandemic, we in fourth grade reading, we went from the bottom to the national average in fourth grade reading and in fourth grade math. We closed the gap substantially between ourselves and the country in eighth grade reading and eighth grade math. And then post pandemic, we've really maintained a lot of those gains. We're starting to see signs of continued progress in some of our areas, and other areas we're still trying to get back to where we were in 2019. But I think a big story is that we have not continued to decline like a lot of other states and like the country. And when you control for demographics in both reading and math, um, across socioeconomics, across race, across other types of categories for kids, Mississippi is leading the country in fourth grade reading and math and in eighth grade math, and we're fourth in eighth grade reading. And people are shocked when you tell them that because they still have this perception that Mississippi is the worst place to possibly put your child in public schools. And in fact, that's not true. Especially if you are a low income child or a Black child, Mississippi public schools are probably going to serve your child better than anywhere else in the country. And I think that's a remarkable testament to the work that so many different people did in Mississippi for 20 years to try to make educational outcomes better for kids.
Thanks. And I just want to amplify that some folks continue to be surprised that Mississippi has strong outcomes for Black students, is one of the best in the country, has strong outcomes for low-income students, one of the best in the country. And not only that, some people think, well, maybe they just got better at a proficiency benchmark, but I've looked at it and Mississippi shifted their entire distribution to the right. They lifted both the floor and the ceiling, which is very rare across the country. Most states, and over the last decade, have seen a big increase at the bottom end. More kids are falling at the tails of the distribution, and Mississippi bucks that trend. So I think it's worth talking more about. Gray, I want to turn over to you. What else would you add or amend to the story about how we got here? Why are we here? And what sort of key landmarks are there along the way?
Well, if you go back to 2012, 14 years ago, and when we had a new legislature and a new term, I think my mindset, and I think Rachel spoke, she actually wrote about this too. And I don't know if we talked about it, but there's a movie that came out around that time called Moneyball. And
Mm-hmm.
Mississippi, as you know, is not a very wealthy state. It's one of the poorest per capita income. And I kind of took that idea and what they did with the Oakland A's of they're not a wealthy Major League Baseball team. And so they had to be very efficient with the funds they used and use evidence-based changes to improve their team. The same thing with education in Mississippi. And we were helped along by Jeb Bush's organization with this particular piece of legislation, the Literacy-Based Promotion Act, but also with the pre-K bill and accountability, and saying, how can we get the biggest bang for our buck? And teaching a child to learn to read so they can read to learn, I think was certainly the best investment that we could make, instead of these big glowing, bills with big titles and that if you looked under the hood, what did they really do other than give a politician a campaign piece of literature? So I think these were really, and I'm not an educator, I'm a lawyer, but as a lawyer, I'm trained to take an issue and advocate for it. And I listen to educators, people like Rachel and others, here's what you need to do. And in particular, the Literacy-Based Promotion Act, they had implemented in Florida back in the 90s and said, this is what worked. And they took other changes that they had learned along the way to provide Mississippi with a good framework to pass that. The pre-K, I think actually Rachel came up, was it a combination of Oklahoma and West Virginia, of what our pre-K bill looked like, that was allowed the local communities to put skin in the game, to feel like they had an investment. Again, we're limited in our financial resources, so we used what money we could from the state and provided that with a match from the locals as well. So a lot of this was trying to be smart with the money we had, and I think that helped in terms of having investment from all the different people that were involved in this, from educators to legislators to parents and administrators.
Rachel, I want to dig in on this a little bit more. Your report for PPI did a really good job of talking about all of this. And then in your Atlantic version of it, you went into the accountability piece in particular. And I think a lot of folks say, well, we're going to do the Mississippi model, and they pick a couple things that they want to copy. And yet in your Atlantic piece, you sort of call out a couple states of missing some key components, and particularly around accountability, both for schools and even for students and educators. So what can other places learn from Mississippi about accountability?
Mm-hmm. The reaction to that Atlanta piece was really interesting because people, I think, maybe just read the headline or maybe the first paragraph and didn't read the whole thing. Accountability, when we talk about an education policy, means a specific thing often, which is rating systems for schools and districts. When we say accountability, that's often what we mean. It's the way that we decide which schools are doing well, which districts are doing well. But accountability is both that policy and also a concept. And I think one of the things that Mississippi has done really well is to think about both of those things as part of our system. Because when we were doing this work, we were building a system. We were not, as Gray said, just doing different bills so that a politician could put it on their campaign literature the next time they ran for office. We were trying to think about how do these things fit together. And we didn't sit down and write out a big strategic plan, but there was some intentionality in that. And I think a lot of states are missing the things that are politically hard. And that may mean both the way that they rate schools and districts in a way that's transparent, that gives real information to parents, but also how do you ensure that when you pass a policy that says teachers are going to be trained or students are going to have a particular experience, a particular curriculum in the classroom, what those things actually happen. And I think that a lot of states believe that all they need to do is mandate something, and then some magical something happens, and that means teachers in classrooms implement those things with fidelity. And that's just not reality, because mandates are one thing, but what happens when a teacher goes in a classroom and closes the doors is another thing. Did that teacher get the support and training they need to be able to do that thing? Do they have the resources? Have they had coaching? Is there anybody coming into the classroom on a regular basis and looking at instruction and going, well, this is not quite right? And I think that states looked at all of the different things that Mississippi did with our literacy policy in particular, which is very comprehensive. And they said, well, it seems hard for us to retain kids at third grade. A lot of people are not going to like that. So we're not going to do that. Or we're going to do that, but then we're going to have all these loopholes so that it's not really a retention policy based on student knowledge. We're going to give parents score reports, but we're not going to give them score reports 3 times a year, or we're not going to give them score reports in a way that makes any sense, to a layperson who's not used to looking at a star assessment, printout. And I think that Mississippi did not think of it that way. I think that what we thought about was, look, if we don't start from a place of honesty with everybody, because we've been lying to ourselves and our children for a really long time and to families. We've been telling people your kid's doing great, the grades look great, the state assessment looks great. And then you look at the national assessment data and there's this huge gap between what we say a proficient child is and what the country says a proficient child is. And that huge gap is part of the reason Mississippi was last. And I think we said, okay, we got to stop doing that. We have to start being very honest, and it's going to hurt some people's feelings, but at the end of the day, we're going to make progress. And that's a better thing than, being sad about somebody's feelings for a little while. And yeah, it was painful to see where we were starting, but we all knew. And so things like parental notification became not a scary thing. It became a right for parents to know, is your child actually reading at grade level? And we're going to tell you 3 times a year whether or not your child is actually reading at grade level. So no one is surprised in 3rd grade if we have to retain you, because we've been telling you 3 times a year since kindergarten that your child is not at grade level. And it puts pressure on both the school and the administrators and the teachers, but also the family. Like, okay, now we know, we have good information. Now we know, what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to start doing something about it in kindergarten, not in 3rd grade in the 2nd semester. And I think that too many states want to get credit for doing something about literacy without actually following through on all of the things that you have to think about in order to actually make that change happen. And that is the frustration that I have, because I have seen this story play out as a person who's been doing education policy now for 20 years, where a good idea comes along, people pick and choose what they like about it. They don't implement any of it with fidelity. There's no accountability for anybody with it. And then they say, oh, well, that didn't work. And then we throw it out the window. When in fact, the science of reading is the way to teach reading. And I think the worst place we could end up from this movement would be if people just say, well, we tried the science of reading and it didn't work.
Let's jump to the 3rd grade retention policy. It's the thing that critics latch onto. They accuse Mississippi of having kids who test in 4th grade because they're older, and maybe they do better because they've had an extra year of instruction, or maybe they just had time to mature. One thing aspect that I'd like to focus on is that the true effects of the policy are not necessarily about the kids who are retained, but it's all about the adult behaviors that change before kids get to that point. So to your point, Rachel, of it's alerting parents when the child is in kindergarten, 1st or 2nd grade, that they're on track and they have reading deficiencies. And that is what the policy drives, rather than just focusing on that one 3rd grade gate. Does that sound right to you, or how do you think about it?
Yes. I mean, I think that is the whole purpose of the retention policy. Certainly when, and Gray should talk about this, when the bill was passed, that was the number one thing that people focused on, was the retention policy. There was a lot of fear around the percentage of children that were going to be retained. There was fear around, well, if you hold a child back, that will hurt their self-esteem and it could be harmful to them later on. There was a lot of conversation around that. School district administrators were like, what are we going to do if we have this huge number of children in 3rd grade? We don't know how to manage, increasing the size of our 3rd grade if kids can't go to 4th grade. But the reality was that was not the point of the law. The law had these other things in it. We're going to test children for reading deficiencies. If they're identified, we're going to send a letter home to parents. We're going to ensure that kids get services, so to prevent them from ever being retained. And then if they are retained, we're going to ensure that in the following year they get something different than what they got in the prior year. But I think everybody knew that this was what was going to hold our feet to the fire about this legislation. And we were going to do everything we could because we passed the pre-K law in the same year at the same time. And when I was writing the pre-K law, I was having regular discussions with ExcelinEd and Gray and everybody else about the Literacy-Based Promotion Act. There was intentionality between trying to align those things so that we could have kids in pre-K, K, 1, 2, 3, who were getting that consistent teaching and resources around literacy. So I think that when people focus on the retention policy, they're sort of missing the point. It is about the adult behavior change all the way from pre-K up until 3, because nobody wanted to retain kids.
Yeah, I mean, but the whole retention policy to me was, if you're not teaching children to read by the 3rd grade, why are you socially promoting them? And you're basically setting these kids up for failure. And as you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it goes back to what Rachel was talking about, accountability, about we had low expectations for kids. And around the country, we do now. These kids can't do this. Let's don't put them in this situation. And we go back to the early 2000s with No Child Left Behind. And the Mississippi accountability standard showed Mississippi kids were 80% proficient. And then I would look at NAEP scores, and we were only 20% efficient. And I would ask the state superintendent, what's going on here? Well, we can't, we don't want to raise those standards. The expectations are too high for our kids. And then we come along and say, no, we're going to change things. We're going to expect kids to be reading by 3rd grade. And we're going to provide you support to do that with the $15 million that was targeted to teach kids in reading and the literacy training, the training of teachers and administrators, but also having the pre and post kindergarten readiness assessment, adding early education. So there was support provided to the teachers. And I remember specifically in those early meetings with our reading panel, and these new teachers who'd been hired as literacy coaches, they said, we've never been taught how to teach this. And I was like, what have y'all been learning? And it was very frustrating. And that's a whole nother issue about our schools of education. But we were providing support, as Rachel alluded to earlier, to the classroom. We weren't just passing a bill and saying, y'all figure it out. We were involved in making sure that this legislation was implemented, and it was implemented with support. And if they needed more support, we certainly came and provided that over time. But they were able to utilize the money we provided for literacy coaches to help schools in the lower performing, lower 25%, and then also provide grants for summer learning loss. I tell you, I'm a judge now. And I see the extent of poverty because one of the things I do is run this drug court. And, you got these parents in drug court have children. And I mean, this is poverty. I know we have poverty all across the country, but Massachusetts, which usually was one of the top performings in my time, their poverty level is not the level of Mississippi poverty. And they were able to ride on their wealth in terms of per capita income and performing well. We were able to take kids who were living at an extreme poverty level and do better. And like you said, it's across the entire spectrum of students, which is remarkable. I mean, that exceeded my expectations of being able to do that. One thing about it that I did think would make a difference is by improving the reading ability, you would see, because an educator told me this, you'll likely see improvements in math. And that is turned out to be true. It's not being sustained, which is another issue, but certainly it's across all subjects, which is exciting to see for students in Mississippi.
There's some kernels I want to return to later, maybe teacher preparation. We'll put a pin in that, and this sort of cross gains of reading gains translate to math gains. I want to come back to both of those. But Gray, I want to throw you a curveball here, and it's based on a conversation I had this week with another state that's trying to do literacy reforms, and the legislature is thinking about, can they get letters home to parents telling parents that their kids are in having reading problems. And one question I had was whether the legislature can trust the Department of Education to write a good letter that is clear, that will give parents a clear signal about what is actually happening. Was that ever an issue for you, or how did you think about that? Of like, you're a legislator, how do you make sure this is implemented well?
Well, I mean, as we were engaged with the State Department of Education, and I, had been previously in the legislature 16 or 18 years, and maybe had been over to the State Department one or two times. After we had passed this legislation, I was over there 20, 30, 40 times. I don't know how long, but we were involved. We weren't in, we were, they were bouncing questions off of us in terms of what are your expectations here. And we were involved in the conversation about implementation. As I said, I am not an educator and I don't pretend to be, but we were talking about where should the money be here, there, and they offered ideas. I had input, but ultimately the educators made a decision. But in the letters, things like that, they certainly, you got to remember, we're a state of now between 490,000 students. So it's like a large city. I mean, we're not 3 million students. And so I think I was very confident they would be able to do this with the leadership at the State Department. Yeah. And that was the other thing, is having confidence in the leadership at the State Department. We worked well together, the legislature and the state superintendent, and that made a huge difference. If you're butting heads, it's not going to work. But we were all pulling in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was a piece of the Literacy-Based Promotion Act that set up something called the reading panel. And on that in the original legislation, Gray had a seat, his counterpart in the House had a seat, and the governor got to put somebody on the panel too. So there was direct oversight of some of these things by the legislature. And I think MDE figured out very quickly that they needed to come to the table and play ball. It was not the time to sort of use their authority to just try to delay or obstruct. And the people that we had at the department at the time were the right people in the department to be figuring this out. They were people who truly knew what they were doing and truly cared. And when Carrie Wright came in November of 2013 and kept going in that direction, I think it was a really good partnership between the legislature and the department.
This is one thing, Rachel, that really comes out in your report, is sort of the teamwork that's going on from the advocacy side on Mississippi First to the State Department to legislators like Gray. So I'd love for both of you to talk about why and how that all came together, and any sort of anecdotes you have about the meshing of them all, or any culture clashes as well. I didn't say who to start. Rachel, do you want to start on that maybe?
When I think back on it, it feels somewhat magical, because when I first started in 2008 and 2009 was my first session, it did not feel like there were, as I say, that it was very fertile ground for reform. I was brand new to advocacy. I had just come out of graduate school. I had been in the classroom previous to that, and I'd been a public school kid, but I'd never been engaged in politics. I don't come from a political family. And so a lot of the things that were going on at the Capitol were just brand new to me. And I was 26 and trying to meet folks from the department, trying to meet folks in the legislature. And it became very obvious to me very quickly that we had a lot of people in leadership who just did not believe, just did not believe that kids could learn. And that if you were a poor kid, if you were a Black kid, if you were, a student with disabilities, if you were any sort of category, you were just not going to learn. And the best we could do was just sort of like, give schools money to do whatever they could. And that was sort of not everybody felt that way, but a lot of people did. And it, I think, prevented us from moving. And we had to have, I looked at it as a process of finding believers who did not feel that way about the situation. Finding people who thought, hey, if we make different choices, if we do smarter things, if we invest our money more wisely, if we give teachers the right support, we can actually make a change for kids. And I was lucky to meet Gray in the Senate. There were some folks I met in the House. And over time, it was like this process of finding other allies, whether they were in the department or in, other advocacy organizations. And it really all came together quite magically in that 2012 session when Gray got appointed as the Senate Education Chair. We had a new lieutenant governor, new governor. The department was in a moment of flux. There were people who had been at the department that were elevated to leadership positions that became instrumental in all of these things. I don't know that if somebody had come in 2010 with a whole bunch of money and said, okay, we're going to write a blueprint and y'all are going to follow it and this is the way it's going to be, if it would have worked. Certainly people had tried to write blueprints and they never seemed to go anywhere. Gray, I think this is one of the hardest things for me to try to explain is how we sort of deputized ourselves to be on Team Mississippi.
Right. I think you're right. It was new people and it kind of grew organically. It wasn't any plan. It just happened. And there were the right people in the right place at the right time. And it wasn't business as usual. And there was a telling time in 2012, my first year in the session, when one of my colleagues presented an A through F grading bill on schools. And the state superintendent, in the past, I'd served on the committee, the education committee since '96. Typically, the process worked, the State Department would bring over their bills that they wanted passed. We would rubber stamp them and move on. But that day, we brought the A through F school grading bill up. The state superintendent said, we need a couple of years to work on this. And this individual was very adamant and said, no, we're going to do it this year. And it was like a spark went off that day, and we passed that. And from there, the ball started rolling. It's like the legislature realized, we're in charge of policy and we're going to make changes because business as usual has not worked. And I think there were a lot of people who were frustrated with that business as usual, and it was time to try some different things. And so in 2013, that's when you kind of saw the push of multiple pieces of legislation that was attractive to different people, the charter bill, pre-K. There was a lot of different legislation if you look back in that time period. But it just kind of grew organically, and I think people were looking for do something different, because what we've seen in the past after multiple times had not worked. And it just, and we felt like, I think there was a lot of confidence that our students could perform better, and we needed to raise expectations for our students.
Great. If you haven't read Rachel's report, she's very complimentary of you and your involvement. And she tells this anecdote in the piece about how she, early on in the process, went to your office and she had mentioned a report and you had printed it out and had noted it up and marked it up. And that resonated with her. And so that speaks to me that you weren't just a normal legislature rubber stamping it. You got really involved here. And even though you say you're not an educator, what was your approach? How did you get interested in this, and sort of how did you approach the work?
Yeah, well, I think that goes to my training as a lawyer. You get a case, you work it up, and I'm like, where is evidence to support the change in this piece of legislation? And so I was very interested. I did dig into education policy during that period and learned a lot and tried to educate myself about it. And certainly Mississippi First and Rachel, they were a great resource. They were able to bring a lot of information that would say what worked and what didn't work. And there was a lot going on across the country during that time period, because there was a lot of money. The race to the top funds were coming out during that time. And but one of the biggest issues, going back to accountability, I think you can't emphasize enough how important having standards and that are, aspirational but achievable, how that's important. And that was part of this, of maintaining strong standards and pushing back against there were some forces that were trying to water down the standards that Mississippi had adopted, and we were able to hold firm on that. And I think they're still in place because you remember testing on students started at third grade, and they won't have to take that test. And so we were able to work to make sure the third grade reading gate test was the same as the requirement from No Child Left Behind on the English language arts, because there was a little pushback with parents about too much testing. And we were able to do that and not lose the integrity of the legislation.
We have a few more questions here, but if anyone listening in the audience wants to add their questions, there's a Q&A function at the bottom that if we have time, we'll get to those. So please add that there. I want to keep rolling on a couple things. One, we talked about teacher preparation earlier. I'd love for both of you to reflect on what else you would have liked to have done or other things that you sort of think are still to be done. Maybe Rachel, we can start with you. Do you want to start on where would you take us for that?
So Mississippi was really lucky to have someone named Kelly Butler, who worked at the Barksdale Reading Institute and had been sort of on the higher ed teacher education beat around literacy for a really long time. And it was because of some of the work that she had done in the early 2000s that we knew that teachers were not getting really any instruction on how to teach reading in their teacher preparation courses. And so there was this big move in the early 2000s to create a Literacy 1 and Literacy 2 course that every elementary educator had to take, and they would have to have these hours. Well, by the time we passed the Literacy-Based Promotion Act, what we discovered was, despite the fact that we had required this Literacy 1 and Literacy 2 course with certain content, teachers are still coming out of teacher prep not prepared to know the science of reading, which is why Mississippi did the training in the first place. There's nothing in the Literacy-Based Promotion Act about teacher training. The only thing in there is that there was a requirement that the State Department of Education create a reading intervention program for our lowest performing schools. But when the folks at the department and people like Kelly Butler and Angela Rutherford, who was at the University of Mississippi and was involved in the reading panel, looked at the situation, they said, look, teachers they don't know how to do this well, and that's part of the problem. And that's why Mississippi invested some of that money into teacher training, because we realized we needed to basically retrain all of our existing teachers. And then we sort of had this epiphany that was like, this is highly expensive and really difficult to do, this process of retraining, thousands of elementary educators. We should do something to require that teachers coming out of teacher prep have this information. We've required these courses. Maybe we should require more courses. But then we settled on, we're going to require a licensure assessment specifically on the science of reading, because the licensure assessments that every state has don't really assess on whether or not teachers know how to teach reading. So we adopted this assessment and we said, if you don't pass the assessment, you can't get any license to teach K-3. And because our pre-K licenses also had K in them, that meant basically you couldn't teach pre-K through 3 in the state of Mississippi unless you passed this assessment if you were a new teacher. And unfortunately, one of the things that we've discovered 10 years later is that we're still having a lot of teacher candidates come out of higher ed who cannot pass that licensure assessment, even though we've now had a decade and everybody knows the content you need to know. We still have teachers coming out who fail that assessment on the first try. And the State Department actually had to recently institute a process for, you can go through a State Department sponsored course and then pass the course assessment at the end to demonstrate your knowledge. But I think one of the things
I didn't know that.
Yeah, one of the things that and Gray, I think you should talk about this because I know that you've had some of these conversations, is that we did a whole lot on the K-12 side of accountability and expectations for adults along with expectations for children. And higher ed was sort of one of the spaces where although we had some collaborative work that the Barksdale Reading Institute funded and supported, we never quite got in the same place that we got with K-12.
Yeah, that was very frustrating. And towards the end, I realized that our schools of education were not preparing students to be teachers. And I, I just the what was it, the national NETQ? Is that the
NCTQ.
NCTQ? I started reading that and getting involved in that, and that was kind of towards the end of my time in the legislature. But it was eye opening to see that our schools of education are not preparing teachers to students to teach. And I don't know what it was going to be, a heavy lift to try to make reforms there, because you do have some independence, but at the same time, I think it was something that was needed. And I don't think it's been done yet. I think there are some good schools that do take care of that, but the measurement is in that report, and I heard all kind of excuses about, well, they don't measure this and that. But at the end of the day, if we're having to provide additional training to teachers because they're not being trained in the schools of education, that's all you need to hear is, and we spend millions on the letters training to make up the deficiency that had not been done in our schools of education. So.
Yeah, there was a Fordham report, nationally representative survey that came out, I think last week, and I wrote about it. And they found something similar. So if teachers were relying on things like letters training, they have a better grounding in the science of reading. If they're relying on their pre-service teacher preparation program, they tend to do worse on basic questions about the science of reading and comprehension, et cetera. I'm going to turn to a question in the chat. We're going to keep rolling here. Manuel Contreras asks, how did Mississippi overcome local control challenges and pushback? How did the SEA develop trust and confidence from local teachers, principals, and school districts to be involved in driving instruction?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll give my part and then let Rachel get into the details. But I think that is a good question. And again, I refer back to the size of our state. And we are a big, like a large, big city with 500,000 or less students. But I think by being mandated by the legislature, you put it in the law, and you have to carry out what the law is. And when we went to the State Department and said, we're serious about this, we want to see this implemented, it was communicated from the state superintendent and the State Department down to the locals that this is the way it's going to be, and you can't do it. And that gets me to another issue about, there were different, is it the formative software and different things like that. We had a approved list. We being the State Department, I should say. The State Department had a approved list. You can only use this formative. Help me out here, Rachel. What is it called? The formative teaching tools, like Renaissance Learning and
yes,
other
the assessments.
groups. You couldn't use Joe's
yeah.
reading shop over here. You had to use these particular ones, and that was being mandated by the State Department. I think some of our school districts had gotten sold something that wasn't in line with teaching reading properly. And that was one of the areas, the specific to what he's asking is, State Department said, this is the list. You can only buy these approved reading programs from this approved list.
Yeah. Yeah, there were a couple of things that the state did around, trying to control for quality on screeners, trying to control for quality on reading intervention programs, trying to control for quality on general ELA curriculum, as well as math curriculum and other things. But I get the local control question a lot, because people say, well, we're a local control state. And y'all, I have been doing this for 20 years. I think I have spoken to someone from every state in this country. I have never had someone tell me they are not a local control state. Never. And in Mississippi, I like to say we like local control until we don't. Because if you go to the legislature and you listen to Gray's former colleagues, you will hear them say, well, this is a local control issue. But then they'll turn around and pass a bill that says, no, the state's going to tell you what you can and cannot do about this other thing over here. It is not a local control issue. Almost never. It is a political will issue. And the issue is whether or not the legislature is willing to take the political heat to say from the state level what you can and cannot do in a school. Local control of schools is a culture thing. It is often not a legal thing. Now, you may have enshrined it in law to allow local school districts to have certain authorities or not. But if the legislature decided that something is important enough for the state to be able to have a say in it, they can. And I think that was one of the things that had to happen in Mississippi, was that the legislature had to decide, actually, we are in charge of this. And having 144 school districts and 144 different ways of teaching reading has not worked for anybody. There's really only one way to teach reading, and that's the science of reading. And that should be the expectation in all 144 school districts. Now, we may give you a choice of what curriculum to use, but the choice to use a curriculum that is not science of reading is not going to be a choice.
And Chad, let me add this too, in terms of things being different in local control. We were at the time, we were one of 3 states that still had elected superintendents. And we changed that in 2015 or 16. And additionally, we worked on administrative consolidation of school districts. There was one school district that had a city school and the county school. The county school was K through 8, and all the kids went to the city school for high school. Why did we have 5 school board members? And anyway, we were making changes that was taking some local control away, but it was for the greater good of being more efficient in the utilization of our resources, going back to the Moneyball concept of let's use our money wisely because we're limited in the amount of money we have.
I think, Rachel, you've already got to this question. It's similar to the local control. This is about teachers' perspective. And so how would you respond to a teacher who may feel micromanaged by the rigorous requirements of this legislation? And they also ask about teacher burnout. So how would you, we talked about the local control from a mostly district or school perspective once it gets into the classroom as well.
So I was as you know, I was a classroom teacher for 2 years. I did Teach for America in my home state, and I did not teach in the community I grew up in, but I did teach in Mississippi. And one of the lasting impressions that experience left on me is how isolating it is to be a teacher, especially if you are in a school that is not very well run, or doesn't have a lot of resources. You are not given training and support about how to do your job, and it's a process of sink or swim trying to figure out what to do. And I was a 7th grade ELA teacher, and I had students who were 3 and 4 grade levels behind on average, and I had some students who couldn't read at all. And if somebody had said to me at that time, hey, we're going to send you a coach who knows what they are doing to help you figure out how to do this, I would have been ecstatic. And that has been the general way that I think teachers who have gotten one of the state coaches have felt about it. When you go interview them and talk to them about what their experience has been. I don't think that always happens with coaching, because I think what a lot of states have done is they give money to districts to go hire coaches, they go hire whomever, and there's not necessarily that deep control around quality. But the state really thought it was important. Like, we are not going to go send somebody into a teacher's classroom to tell them what to do if they don't know how to do this job really, really, really well. Because who wants somebody to come in your classroom and tell you what to do if that person does not know any better than you do? And so the state was really rigorous about the process of picking coaches, and really rigorous about the process of making sure that when we send somebody into a classroom, they better truly be a master teacher who's truly going to be a support to another teacher. And that's the way the state looked at it. And I think that's part of why our coaching program has been a success, is that we had the department had such an eye towards, this is how we build trust, this is how we build buy-in, this is how we signal to teachers in other classrooms that what we're doing is worthwhile, is that we give them the very best possible training and support, and we show them how much it can make a difference for their kids. And I think one thing that happened, because we didn't give coaches every classroom because we didn't have the money for it. Gray can tell you, especially in those years, the budget was really tight. And so for the legislature to have committed millions of dollars in a line item just for this was kind of an extraordinary thing to do. And so that meant that there were a whole bunch of teachers in a whole bunch of classrooms in Mississippi who weren't getting that coaching. They could access the training. And then it becomes a question of, well, why should I go do this? Well, when you see the progress that other teachers are making in their classrooms after they've had the training, you start going, maybe I want that too. Because we act like teachers don't want to be good at their jobs. And I've never met a teacher who doesn't want to be good at their job. I've never met a teacher who says, I don't want to know a better way to do this. I don't want to know a better curriculum. I don't want to have a better path. And when we talk about teacher burnout, we don't often talk about how we're asking them to do new things over and over, and we're not giving them any support, and we're not telling them like what they can stop doing to make time for the new things either. And so I think that there was certainly a lot of skepticism and a lot of controversy, but over time, I think that quality of the training and that quality of the support and the outcomes is where we got that buy-in.
We're coming down to our last few questions. So if you have anything else you want to put in the Q&A, please do so. Rachel, Gray, I want to get your perspective on this question, which is most of the attention on Mississippi is on the reading reforms, but Mississippi has also seen a rise in math outcomes. And so I wanted to get your take on whether it's just that kids are able to read better, and so that helps them in math. There's some sort of transfer, or is it something about the process of working on reading and isolating kids who need more help is also helpful in math? Or what else? What are your theories? Why are we seeing some gains in math too?
Rachel, I'm gonna defer to you.
Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting thing because people talk about our reading scores and they almost never talk about our math scores. But in a lot of ways, our math scores are even more impressive than our reading scores. First of all, our eighth grade math scores have continued a strong upward trajectory in a way that we don't quite see yet with our eighth grade reading scores. And Mississippi did just pass an adolescent literacy bill to try to improve literacy in fourth through eighth grade. But you really see this strong trend upward, fourth grade math and then eighth grade math also. And I think this goes back to this question of standards and assessment and accountability. Because if you look at what math we expected kids to know when I was in school compared to what math we expect them to know now, it's night and day. Kids are learning at a math at a much deeper level. We are asking them to understand why multiplication works, understand what a fraction really is. We're asking them, word problems on assessments. And I think, Gray, this is part of why the person told you that if you improve reading skills, you can improve math skills, because if you have very low reading skills, it's difficult for you to understand what may be asked of you on a math test. But the underlying math, we have also enormously raised our expectations. And when we were talking about standards, Gray, you may remember this, we brought a group of teachers to the Capitol, and one of them was a math coach in DeSoto County, and she came and she did a demonstration before the Senate Education Committee about what math was looking like now. And it was a very different way of teaching math and expecting what we expected kids to know, to the point where some of those teachers on that advisory council that Mississippi First had told us that they were actually having to go through math problems with their colleagues to make sure that their colleagues understood the math before they taught it every week, because it was a very different expectation. And I think we haven't talked a lot about that, but I do think that's something that happened, is that of course kids are not going to know, algebraic expressions and all these other things if we've never taught them to that level ever in our curriculum. But I think that although we are just now beginning a math initiative in the same way that we've done a literacy initiative, we've sort of been quietly following this same playbook in math for a really long time because we had such a shift. with our standards and our assessment.
I'm going to give another question from the Q&A. Nazira Purnell is asking, how did Mississippi build buy-in among educators and districts to believe that dramatically raising expectations for students was achievable?
Well, at first there was a lot of skepticism.
Yes, there was definitely a lot of skepticism, but I think it just you built confidence, I think, on the local level with teachers over time. And when we passed the legislation, that there was money behind it to support teachers in the classroom. And when they saw with the literacy coaches and the materials that were being put out to the teachers and to the school districts and the letters training, I think over time they realized that we were serious about changing the way we taught children to read. And I think certainly there's always a built-in mistrust between the legislature and educators. And that's always tough to bridge that gap. But I think in this particular instance, and we were, as I said, put money towards early education and some other things. And I think that over time, people realize that we, as I said, the barriers, the old traditional barriers between the legislature and educators kind of broke down on this in this particular case. And look, I can't say enough about Dr. Wright, Dr. Carrie Wright. I think she's now state superintendent of Maryland. She came in and she didn't have any ties with anybody in Mississippi, which was great. And so she was not beholden to anybody. And she came in there and said, we're going to do this and we're going to make it work. And she was a champion. She went around to all the schools and all over the state. And the teachers, I felt like, had confidence in her. She was a former teacher. And I think she helped build confidence and say, we're from the State Department and we are going to help you. And in the different ways that Rachel has mentioned before. So that helped a lot that she was championing this idea. And as the governor was and lieutenant governor as well. I mean, everybody was talking about it. And it just took time. And over that time period, I think you got confidence in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. And I think we gave educators the message that we had confidence in them. We didn't go around and decide, we're going to get rid of all the educators in Mississippi and we're going to go get some other different people in here because we don't think these people can do the job. That's not the mindset we had. We had the mindset, these are our teachers. They care about our kids. We need to give them the supports they need to get the job done. And at the State Department of Education, when Dr. Wright came in, one of the big things that happened is they changed who was at the department. They started focusing on how do we get people into the department in these roles who actually know how to do instruction. Because if you're in charge of curriculum and instruction at the department, you better really know curriculum and instruction, because when you go out to a school district and say, this is how you should be doing it, you better be speaking from a place of credibility. And if you are a school district and you need support and you don't think that when you call the department, you're going to get anybody worth anything, then you're not going to have any trust in the department. And so the department realized that, and the legislature also passed a bill to help them get new staff into the department. And they started to really staff up around professional, what kinds of people do we need for professional development? What kinds of people do we need to have in the department who are going to be able to provide real support to districts? And so it was a process over time because, I don't think teachers trusted the legislature at the beginning. It was a lot of change all at once. But the other thing I think that we did is that we did not stop. So unlike some other states, we weren't telling teachers, this is the new thing every 3 years. And stop doing what we told you to do this other thing. We were doing the same things over and over, and we were just getting better and better at it. And I also think that builds trust, because when you have a system where a teacher in a classroom doesn't know if they're going to be doing this curriculum, that curriculum, if we're going to be doing this method, that method, it's really hard for you to get to be an expert at any one thing. And so the consistency, I think, was a really important thing too.
That's a good point, Rachel, about the stability and consistency. We didn't come with another big change. That we stayed with that, and they worked on that over the next 8 years. There was stability in the legislature. We're going to leave this alone. If anything, we would improve it with the licensure test and other things that we did over time. That's a good point.
We're running out of time, but anything that you would leave folks on the call with, like what if you were giving some advice to all that you've learned and a new state was starting over and they wanted to run the Mississippi Marathon and start from the beginning, starting line, what would you say to focus on? I know there's a lot, but how would you condense that?
My quick input would be, as some states had done before I left, come down and look what we did and how we did it, and listen, and then but it has to be a team effort. It can't be one individual or the legislature. They have to bring the State Department in and the governor's office, and sometimes that's probably not possible in some states. But if you're going to be successful, you have to bring all the interested parties together with teachers and administrators and say, we want to do this, because it is, some of the things are not politically viable in some places. I get it, but sometimes you got to take risk, and for Mississippi, it paid off. So,
yeah. I talk a lot about the team, and I feel so grateful that we had the team that we had. I can't imagine doing this without people like Gray, people like Kim Benton, people like Carrie Wright, people like Kimiana Burke, people like Kelly Butler. I can't imagine doing this work or having done this work without these people. And these are Mississippi people. We didn't go and shake the trees. Carrie Wright was from outside, but other than Dr. Wright, everybody else was a Mississippi person. And if you were building, the Avengers of education, you would not have come to Mississippi and opened doors and found any of us probably. But we decided being last was not acceptable anymore, and we were going to do whatever it took. And there are people in every state in the country who are capable of that. You don't need anybody but yourselves. You just have to decide that this is going to be the most important thing to you in your state. And that's where you get the political courage, and that's where you get the political will.
All right, I will say, take my privilege as the moderator and say, let's wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Gray. There's a lot to read about Mississippi, and I thank you for taking the time to do it today. If you haven't read Rachel's piece, either for PPI or in The Atlantic, both are worth your time. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining, and talk to you all soon. Thank you.